Good morning, everybody. I've sort of been stalling for a few minutes because I'm looking at the attendee list and it looks like people are still streaming in. We just give it one more minute and then I'll begin. Okay, so welcome everybody to I think it's the second webinar that I've done this year for Sygnia. I'm very delighted to be here. Also, going to give you a little bit of a warning about what's to follow, which is it's really a global focused presentation. So in other words, it's a presentation that will take a global view about hopefully an issue that we all think about, an issue that we all are aware of, that we sits in the back of our mind, namely this notion of the digital divide. And really the presentation is actually based on research that I've done with colleagues for the G20, the group of 20 economies, as you know, that meets regularly to discuss the world economy and sort of policy collaboration and a variety of issues. But the principal attempt in what you're going to hear is to try and get us to move a little bit away from too nonchalant a description and understanding of the digital divide, and to try and get us to a place where, in fact, we can have a little bit more of a detailed understanding of what it means about an economy or regions of the world facing growing technology gaps or a growing digital divide. So really, I'm going to try and build this up slowly, but hopefully it'll get you to a point where you'll come away with a more nuanced understanding of the drivers, well, the components of the digital divide across regions of the world and the drivers of the digital divide. So with that, you will see here lots of language and lots of sort of phrases and economist sort of insertions and measurements, but I'm hoping that you'll come away with a much more nuanced understanding of this notion of the digital divide. So I'm going to take you through why I think we need to be a bit more, let's say, value added in our understanding of the digital divide, and therefore I'm going to propose a new measure. And that's what I do in this presentation of what I call the global technology gap. But in order to do that and present that new measure, I actually need tools. I need sub-indicators. And I take you through this idea, and it'll come up continuously, this idea of technology adoption and technology production. And I'm going to give you some data on technology adoption, and I'll take you through that, and technology production in the world economy. And then I'm going to take you through my third measure of the digital divide, human capital accumulation. In other words, education, right? And focus on higher education. I then bring all these things together, technology adoption, technology production, and human capital, into something called the Global Technology Gap Index. And I actually start telling you a story about who's won and who's lost regionally in terms of what we would normally call the digital divide. So just by way of background, I don't need to tell you, right? The fourth industrial revolution is with us. It's launched very much by the 1970s sort of microelectronics revolution. So if you go back, this fourth industrial revolution that we're living through has its origins in the 70s. So when we see the spread of personalized computer usage and so on, we're now in a period where actually, and hence the notion of the fourth industrial revolution, where these new technologies are embedded and inserted into all forms of our lives, both working lives and personal lives, right? I focus principally on sectors and workplaces, but you know these things and you live with them on a daily basis. But just to give you an idea, you've got computerized algorithms in industrial and service applications throughout different sectors in the economy. Cloud services never used to be a feature of any sector. They're now directly involved in how we think about, let me just get rid of my laser pointer. They're directly involved in how we think about production at the firm level. The Internet of Things, big data analytics, immersive communications, artificial intelligence. So just one indicator is that currently there are about 2.7 million robots in operation globally, but this has expanded just over the last 6 years by about 13% per year, every year for 6 years. And that's going to increase. In fact, you even have, which you never had 10, 15 years ago, an institute dedicated to measuring the spread of robots and robot usage. So the problem, though, and so one indicator, just a little bit of a plug, seeing that you're dialing into a Sygnia event. I was looking again at the website and counting carefully. Sygnia at the last count has 8 products dedicated purely to let's call it the fourth industrial revolution. Everything from the Sygnia 4IR unit trusts to the FANG to the ETFs. On solar active, health innovation, the China new economy. So this is something that's embedded even in how we think about our investment strategies. The problem, and that's the one I want to take you to, is that these onset of new technologies are unevenly distributed across countries, and hence the notion of the digital divide, right? So we know that this thing exists. We know there's technology gaps. We know there's, bandwidth is much faster in the US and it's very slow here. It's much cheaper in country Y versus. That's not enough, right? Those are simple empirical observations that are not collected into a uniform understanding and empirically exhaustive understanding of what we mean by the technology gap. So I want to move away from the simplistic notion of the digital divide. It was included in the marketing so I could just drag you in and give you a much more detailed, perhaps more boring understanding of how to think about the technology gap. But they're 2 really important concepts to separate when you think about the digital divide. The first is technology adoption versus technology production, right? And so what do we mean by that? Technology production, let's start with adoption. Technology adoption or technology consumption, if you like, involves usage of new technologies. So you can imagine using the internet, using mobile phones, cloud computing. So if you're at the interface where you are using technology regularly at the firm or the household level, then we could argue that there's an intensive or growing technology adoption in that particular country. Technology production, on the other hand, is, as you'd expect, right? The production and, in the main, especially if you're a small open economy, exporting of new technology, right? That's going to be used by either firms or consumers. The key is to separate the 2 and understand, so say where I'm going, understand how the evolution of production and consumption in the technology space has changed at the country level. Are countries increasing both technology adoption and technology production at the same level? Or do we find that there's a growing gap between countries? That's how we anchor this notion of the digital divide. So if every country's pace of adoption, right, technology adoption, so usage, and technology production was exactly at the same rate over time, we don't have a digital divide. But if that gap's growing and it's growing faster between certain countries, well, then we've got a problem, right? And as we start thinking about technology production and consumption, we need to think also about how to overcome that gap. So what are the potential measures? And so as you can see, I'm setting this thing up so that as we move from thinking about the, as I call it, the nebulous notion of the digital divide, I want to use technology adoption and technology production. But I need measures, and I need measures that are available across countries over time so that I can compare. So it's no use having measures that are only available for 15 countries for 5 years, right? So I need fairly baseline widely available data for technology adoption and technology production. And you'll begin to see this come to life, I promise. So technology adoption, the obvious and the most easiest is internet usage, right? So I want to understand individuals at the country level that are using the internet and using it regularly. So the data we have gives us, as you can see there, individuals using the internet from any location in the last 3 months, right? What do we mean by internet access? Well, it's via the computer, personal phone, digital assistants, a games machine, digital TV, it doesn't matter, right? The key is somebody and individuals at the country level or households are accessing the internet. We have data on that. We have data going back 20, 30 years from the World Bank on that. But another really important measure for technology adoption, remember, right, it's consumption, it's usage at the country level, is that the country is importing computers or any kind of information communication technology intensive product or service, right? So it could be anything from computers right through to electronic components, electronic communication, cell phones, and so on. If you are intensive in importing those types of commodities and services, in fact, you are a high technology adopter. That's fine, but we do want to make sure that we understand whether you are also at the frontier of producing technology, new technologies, right? And here, and the one that's really going to possibly be surprising in terms of the results we see, we use patent applications. So patent applications, right? And we know that patent applications have a very clear procedure and process, right? You've got to file them through a particular institution. And here we use the Patent Cooperation Treaty procedure, which is a global landing place for all patents that countries and residents of countries can lodge their patents with. And the data we have, again, going back 20 years, for the World Bank, from the World Bank, collated by the World Bank, but drawn from the treaty data, ensures that the patent holder has protection of the invention, right, for at least 20 years. So we also pick up those patents that have been withdrawn. The other key technology producer data point that we want is, of course, the opposite of imports, right, is high-tech exports. And again, we have to play with the data in terms of what is the best measure. So we went with high-tech exports as a percentage of total manufacturing exports. You can see the list of data there, the list of products there. Aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals, scientific instruments, electric machinery. These are all products with high R&D intensity. So the point we're trying to make, if you recall, a couple of years back, I spoke about economic complexity, right? This is a really important measure, right? That countries that are at the technology frontier are not going to be exporting frozen fish. They are going to be exporting X-ray machines, right? And so in many ways, technology producers are high-intense, high-tech exporters. We use these 4 data points or these sub-indicators for technology adoption and technology production mainly because of data availability and symmetry, as I said. So we want to be sure, yes, I can add far more data points, right? I could add more indicators, far more detailed, far more interesting, perhaps like price of broadband and so on, but the data availability often constrains us. I don't get too hung up about that often because you would tend to find that if you get the most pervasive available data, you'll tend to find the same results, even if you took a subsample of less available data. So you see my last bullet says, well, we're not quite there yet. And the reason is there's something missing, right? Because one of the key things you want to think about, right, in the technology space in terms of the digital divide is human capital. Because one of the most important drivers of either the growing digital divide or in fact ways in which you can close the digital divide is what economists call human capital. Just think of that as education, right? Or schooling or accumulation of high education and so on. Now, what I'm really interested here in trying to, remember, I'm trying to understand our measure of the digital gap is I'm trying to get at that level or type of education that's important for closing the digital divide or explaining the technology gap. So I'm not really interested at this stage, although I'll talk about it a bit later, at schooling, but more at higher education. So I take two measures. I want to see what we call gross enrollment rates, right? So the percentage of people in the given age cohort that are at a tertiary institution relative to their share in the population. So simply put, I want to understand enrollment rates at universities and universities of technology at the country level. I have data on that. But here's the important nuance, and I think some of the data there has already been partly shared through the Sygnia team on Twitter, is I'm not happy only with enrollment rates. I do want to get a peg. I do want to get a measure of quality differentials. And so I enter into the sort of world university rankings data, and the QS data is publicly available, some of them less so. So I use the QS rankings and I look at the top 500 institutions by country level, right, in selected fields. So I'm only interested in the STEM fields, right? So just remember, because I view the STEM fields as critical for advancement of the technology frontier at the country level. So a little bit of maths just so that you can orientate yourself and maybe just to keep you awake is, in simple terms, what am I doing? I've told you I've got all these things going on. I'm trying to understand the technology gap. That's this TG here. That's all you need to know, right? And at the country level, what is it? It's a function of, right? It's made up of technology adoption. I told you that, right? Technology adoption, internet usage and that stuff. Technology production, ICT exports, remember, right? Patents, very key. But it's also a function of human capital, right? Tertiary enrollment rates and so on. So this is a really important mental note for you to make, because these three things on the right-hand side here are the components that are going to feed into my measure of the global technology gap. So I must emphasize, and I know it sounds strange, but this is a first. We've never done this before globally, right? So in the process of publishing it and shared it with the G20, but this is the first time we've actually put together a sort of synthesized empirical measure of the world's technology gap. So what I'm now going to do, just so you can understand the procedure, is I'm going to take you through those three components, right? Technology adoption, technology production, and human capital sequentially. But I need to get you into the guts of the data. And in order to do that, I'm going to just simply do rates of change. So look at how internet usage or ICT exports and so on, imports have changed over time at the regional level. You'll see the data now. But the second thing that's really important as my entry point into the composite measure is to understand inequality. And I use inequality in adoption, inequality in production, inequality in human capital accumulation. And in order to understand inequality, I use a Gini coefficient. You've heard of the Gini coefficient for South Africa in terms of income. Well, the Gini coefficient is just a measure of dispersion, right? So I just apply the Gini coefficient measure to how unequal, for example, is internet usage in the world, how unequal is technology production, and so on. I then combine all of these rates of change and Gini coefficients into this composite measure of the technology gap. And I come up with, and I'm really not going to take you through the maths of it, but I come up with a global technology gap index. And that's a really important measure for how that, in the synthetic measure, technology gaps have changed in the world economy over time. Okay, enough of the background. What does the data show? So here you go. This is the first landing place empirically for technology adoption. Let me take you through some of the numbers. So what do we see about technology adoption? Remember, I told you it's internet usage and ICT goods imports, right? So you can see here, right? If I just, sorry, let me just remove my camera. Okay, there we go. So you can see here that average internet usage rate, right, has increased. So just to orientate yourself around the tables. So I've got my countries from high income by groups right through. I've broken them down. These are fairly standard. This turns out to be quite important. Upper middle income relative to upper middle income when I exclude China. I've got the G20 there, and I've got the world data, so the aggregate data. And I've got it for usage, internet usage, because I'm interested in technology adoption, and then ICT goods imports. Break it down by years, percentage change. Internet usage, right, per 100 people, 10 out of 100 or 11 out of 100 people in the 2000s, let's call it. Massive increase, 55 out of 100 people, right? So five-fold increase, right, in global internet usage rates over the period. So 2000 to 2020. That's a significant increase in adoption rates. But what's important is that the adoption rates are differential. So now we start thinking about inequality. We start thinking about the digital divide. They are unequally distributed across the regions of the world. So let's start with the biggest disparity. In high-income countries, right, there's your internet usage rate, 84 out of 100 people, right? It was already 30, but it's already 84 out of 100 people in the later period. Now compare that to low-income countries. That's down here. Only 12 out of 100 people, right, despite the massive increase of 28% over the period, so significant increases, but the absolute value is still very, very low. Even if you look at where South Africa is, which is upper middle income countries, it's still 60 out of 100, right? Significant increases across the board for most regions, but the gaps and the disparities remain large, particularly between high-income countries and the rest of the world. And this is a theme that comes back continuously. What about ICT good imports? They've marginally declined across the regions, but in essence, there hasn't been really any significant change, right, in ICT goods imports. So in terms of moving the dial, as you become more of an intensive importer of ICT goods, you haven't seen significant changes across most regions of the world. Now, I move to technology production, but I want to pause a little bit and switch with these two graphics, which I included belatedly actually in my presentation, around global patent applications. So remember, if you go back to the little equation, I move from technology adoption now to technology production. My first measure is patent applications. Just look at this data. Look at what's happened. Firstly, let's just focus on the world, is you've seen, if you wanted an indicator for the rise of technology or the importance of technology and the fourth industrial revolution, look at patent applications data. It's a massive increase, right? They go from 820,000 in 2000, right, globally, to over 2 million, right, in the later period. That's a growth of 8.5% every year for 20 years. I'll repeat that. That's a growth of 8.5% every year for 20 years in patent applications. But what I want you to look at, and look at the graphic below, is where the growth has come from. The growth is driven by China. So patent applications, right, is essentially, and the growth in patent applications is a story of how China's contribution to global patent applications has just exploded over the last 10 years. In fact, while the global growth was 8.5%, China's average growth rate over that period is 253%, right? So how do we understand that number? If you look at the bottom graph, China's patent applications in 2000 stood at about 3% of the global share. So that's this first bar graph at the bottom here, right? By now, it's 58% of the global patent applications lodged every year. In addition, so now you begin to understand patent application inequality, right? Or technology production inequality. If you're thinking about who's producing, who's at the frontier of technology, well, China, and then look at the last bullet point, and the US. Together, they account for 71% of all patent applications in the world economy. If we think there is there's a closing digital divide, right? If you focus purely on patent applications, you've got huge, huge challenges. And so I take that data, make it a little bit more rigorous, and we go back to this table that you've seen before for technology consumption, but this is now production rates. So I look here at the average number of patent applications and high-tech exports, really important. It's not all bad news. You'll see a little bit of good news in high-tech exports, but let's just get to what do the numbers show. You see the significant increase, right, in patent applications, but I want you to see how patent application growth rates have flatlined in high-income countries, not done really much, but massive growth in the upper middle-income country sample, but of course, that's China. And how do you know it's China? Well, let's do the same thing. So 36,000, right, is the average number of patent applications by residents over that period. And look at how that number declines, right, when you exclude China. The more worrying thing is, and this is a sense in which you think about inequality, right, or the digital divide, is when you look at low-income countries, look at the number of patent applications, right? It's abysmal. If we, though, move to high-tech exports, we do see that high-tech exports, so our measure here is as a percentage of manufacturing exports, are much, much higher, 15% in high-income countries, right? Okay, and only 5% in low-income countries. But the little bit of good news is that it's gone from 0.5% to 5% in low-income countries. So there is a shift, right, towards technology production. You'll be looking at exports or high-tech exports in low-income countries. And that's part of global value chains. We don't discuss this here. And the spillover into, I think, economies such frontier economies such as Vietnam and others. So the idea that global value chains will see high-tech exports moving from country of origin of patent like the US to countries such as Vietnam, I think is an important new development. So a little bit of good news there. Now, I said to you, right, that so I've given you all the percentage change measures in terms of technology consumption and technology production. But I said to you that I do want to specifically understand something called the Gini coefficient. You've heard of it, but in those measures. So in other words, I'm asking the question, how unequally distributed is that particular measure? So specifically, when you saw the internet usage globally, right, in the early period, that Gini coefficient, right? So if I took internet usage across countries and I derived a Gini, how unequally distributed was internet usage? And it turns out to be very unequal, 0.63. But the good news, so hence the notion of the digital divide, digital inequality, if you wanted, right, as measured by internet usage, has actually declined. So in fact, this is a very healthy inequality level, right? Remember, it's a global measure. So we have to be careful about only assuming that this decline from 0.63 to 0.32 is a good thing, and therefore digital inequality as measured by internet usage is fine. Why? Because remember, I showed you the low-income country data where very, very few individuals in those economies on average are still internet users. And in fact, UNIDO within the UN system, they refer to these group of low-income countries as laggards, that these economies are technology laggards that have fallen so far behind technology frontiers that they're going to struggle to catch up. What about other measures of inequality? Well, inequality in ICT goods imports, remember that's our second measure of technology adoption, has declined. I would say not sufficiently, but at least the absolute value is not very high. But look at the patent applications. This is where I want to take you. Technology production. This is the frontier. This is where things are moving in the future. Can you keep up with the leaders? Well, technology inequality, as measured by patent applications, has a Gini of 0.93, which is absolutely extraordinary. Remember, Ginis go from 0 to 1. So the closer you're to 1, the more unequal, right? 1 means that one country would have produced all the patent applications in the world. Well, it's 0.93, right? And we know why, because it's China and the US that constitute 71% of all patent applications. And what's worse is that inequality has gone up. 0.95. So it's absolutely extraordinary how it's almost as if the world economy, and there I'm being a little bit populist, has shifted from, countries in the world in terms of patent applications to high-income countries to effectively a two-horse race between China and India, and the rest are falling behind. And I think that's a really important warning signal about technology production. What about high-tech exports? Again, slight decline, but still highly unequal, right? At 0.47, 0.45, you've got a significant level of inequality between countries that are exporting high-tech goods, right? So remember, I've now, again, back to that little equation. If you've locked that into your head, I had technology consumption or technology adoption, technology production, TATP, and then I had HK, human capital. Because, of course, the only route or the surefire route to closing the digital divide at the country level is you better have sufficient number of skilled people. You better have highly skilled individuals that can actually enter into these either new jobs, right, new high-tech jobs, or in fact be at the frontier of patent applications, high-tech exports, and so on. So we asked the question, are these countries actually at the frontier of technology production, and mainly production, but potentially consumption as well, to facilitate technology consumption? Now, I want to take one step back, because I want to lead into a discussion about quality, right? Because I think too often in the education sphere, we focus a lot on quantity, so years of schooling and years of higher education, and very little attention has been paid to quality, mainly because of data challenges, but I think also because it's easier to measure. So this is now new data, and here I'm only looking at schooling, so as opposed to higher education, at learning adjusted, so the fancy phrase, learning adjusted years of schooling, right? And learning adjusted years of schooling is a measure of adjusting the years of schooling that an individual has officially relative to their actual operational capacity given that year of schooling. So what do I mean? Somebody may formally have a grade 9 or a grade 12 certification, and it's done through standardized test scores. We know that at a standardized test score level or a standardized exam level, you should have a certain numeracy and literacy level to operate at, say, grade 12. Pupils take that test, and if, for example, the educational experts will tell you that you need to score 60 out of 100 to be at par to operate at a grade 12 level, right? If you score 50 out of 100, you are below a grade 12 level in terms of the quality of that schooling that you've accumulated relative to your official grade. So if that makes sense, what we're trying to understand is, what are the expected years of schooling relative to learning adjusted years of schooling? And what you tend to find, right, is that every single region of the world, right, has learning adjusted years of schooling that are actually below what the actual years of schooling are, right? And that's a really important measure. So if I can just take you through, let's say, the upper middle income countries, which would be where South Africa is, right? So and let's call this grade 12. So let's say you are officially a grade 12 graduate in an upper middle income country. You then take this test. So you are a grade 12 student, you go and you're in South Africa, you take that test, right? On average, in an upper middle income country, the test score says that you're not a grade 12 student, you're actually a grade 8 student. So simply put, on average in middle income countries, grade 12 students are actually grade 8 students in terms of the quality of their schooling, right? But notice this, that as you go to poorer countries, right? Not only is the accumulation level lower, right, but the gap is higher. And that's what this data shows, right? So low-income countries are operating at 50% of the mean years of schooling in terms of quality, right? Much better in high-income countries, but not at 100%, right? So what's critical is that even at the schooling level, you've got these gaps between quantity and quality that operate. And the gaps are larger, the poorer the country is. So if you think of the digital divide, the key way in which you're going to close that digital divide, right, is to improve this gap, right, is to make sure that at the schooling level, you've got individuals that are operating at much higher quality than has been the case at the moment. So for all the nervous South Africans who are thinking about the children and the schools they're in, just remember the following: this is heterogeneity by country exists. So South Africa, I'm not saying that's where South Africa is, right? It may be lower even, and certainly within countries, right? And therefore at the school level, there's heterogeneity, right? So in fact, if you take where your son or daughter is at school, they may even be above the high income country average. We don't know that. So just keep that in mind. These are averages. But I'm not really focused, at least in my measure of the technology gap. I'm not really interested, and I can't really measure based on the data I have, the schooling quality differentials. And I want to move more towards tertiary enrollment. So in other words, I want to move towards higher education. And that's what I do. So just in terms of the descriptive data, I look at tertiary education and I look at gross enrollment ratios. So in other words, I'm focused on the proportion, right? That's the ratio there, the proportion of individuals that are enrolled for and within tertiary institutions across these different regions of the world. The good news, more or less, is that it's been rising. So we do see tertiary enrollment rates increasing across regions of the world. But notice one thing is the gap's not closing, right? So you don't really see, so again, come back to my measure of what's going to drive a closing technology gap in the world economy is tertiary enrollment rates. Well, the gap's not really closing. And in fact, not only is it closing to some extent in the later years, for low-income countries, the gap has widened, right? And if you wanted to peg a number on the differential, high-income countries have tertiary gross enrollment rates. So think of this as university enrollment rates that are about 10 times that of low-income countries. So you don't even have a sufficient stock of human capital at the higher education level to even begin to try and close this digital divide. And that's a really crucial deterrent obstacle to closing the technology gap. But as I said to you, and for me, the patent applications data is the one real sort of, we didn't expect that number, but the second one was the quality differentials in STEM fields. So first, just by way of background, we look at, so as I said, I'm not really that interested, well, I am interested in tertiary enrollment rates, but it doesn't really get to my technology story. And in order to get to the technology story, I need to look at STEM graduates, right? So remember, that's those in science, technology, engineering, and the medical sciences, right? And in order to get that, I do have data. Again, remember, I need data that goes back enough years. And it turns out I do have data from the WDI, but I think it comes from UNESCO, that gives me graduates for STEM programs by these regions. Now, just remember one thing, it's conditional data, right? So in other words, you must be enrolled in a tertiary institution in order to be in a STEM program. And the semi-good news, right, is that the gaps in STEM enrollments are slightly smaller. So in other words, even though you've got a large gap in university enrollment rates across regions, once you get in and you look at enrollment rates by field of study, the gaps across regions are narrower, right? There is, though, this worrying decline. Look at this. Over the last decade, you've seen the significant decline in low-income countries' STEM enrollments, right? And that for me would suggest that not only do we run the risk of making it very difficult, if you think of tertiary enrollment rates, to close the digital divide, it may actually be being exacerbated because of this growing divide. Now, I then said, well, if you recall, I had two measures, right? Because I know now you've remembered all of this, is that I had two measures for human capital. I had the gross tertiary enrollment rates, and then I switched to the quality ranking. I was interested in ranking of STEM fields. And the next piece of data is really, really fascinating. So I then look at the top 500 institutions in the globe, remember, using the QS World University Rankings by subject. So I'm not interested in all at the university level in the aggregate. I'm interested in the STEM fields, so engineering and technology, natural sciences, life sciences, and medicine. Those are the STEM fields, right? And I asked the question, which are the top 500 educational institutions by subject and country income classifications? If you look down here, let's just take you through total STEM, right? They are in the world, 1,523, right, institutions in the STEM fields that are ranked in the top 500. 1,200 of those, right, are actually in high-income countries. Just think about that. 80% of the top 500 ranked universities, right, in the world reside in high-income countries. 80%. So if you're thinking of high quality, if you're thinking, and top 500, you know, is a fairly generous ranking, right? 500, not top 200, which you often see in the media. It's top 500. That's a fairly large sample of universities. The overwhelming majority, right, are in high-income countries. Note that there is a rank ordering in terms of income category. 15% sit in upper middle income countries, right? But look at some of the individual data. There's only one, right, top 500 university in the STEM fields in a low-income country. Only 62 in lower middle-income countries. So as you'd expect from the headline figure, there's a massive drop-off in terms of income classification. But the key differential, right, if I come back to my notion of laggards and leaders, is that it's low-income countries, the large share of low-income countries are going to fall further and further behind. Lower middle income and upper middle income countries, including China and excluding China, at least have some base of human capital in STEM fields to catch up or to at least participate in the fourth industrial revolution. I think low-income countries are in big, big trouble. So we took some of the data around the G20. So I broke up. So if I just take you there back, I took these 1,095, and I broke. So I should maybe just stick around here and just you can look at the individual fields of study. So natural sciences, life sciences, and medicine, and you'll find the distributions are more or less the same. So it's not as if there's a particular bias in terms of subfields of study within STEM. It's pretty much dominant across all fields of study, right? What about taking the G20 number? So in other words, taking the 1,095 institutions in the G20, this number here, and break it down by country. So within the G20, let's just run through this. Of the 1,095, right, G20 economies, where the top 500 institutions in STEM reside, okay, 21% of them are actually in the US. So the highest number of top 500 STEM institutions, right, are in the US. And let's just run through, as you'd expect, the rank ordering, and then followed by the UK, and then I think it's China up there. So one thing that you do want to keep in mind, though, right, so a little bit of good news for South Africa is, but those economies, in particular China, should have large numbers of STEM universities because they're large economies. They've got massive populations. A little bit of I don't take the population of of working age or those that should be at university. I take the global population because I assume this is a public good. So once you educate individuals, they will serve the society, so to speak. So for China to have 100, maybe actually a bit too low given its population. So how do I do that? I look at the country's share of the world's population. So if the share of the world's population for China, it's 18%, they should have 18% of the world's STEM universities. They only have 6. So the ratio is what I measure here. Do you have a disproportionate share, right, of universities, STEM universities in the world, given your share of the world's population? For Australia, definitely. Australia is, if you like, has an abundance, relative abundance of high quality STEM institutions, a really crucial result. But same with the usual suspects, Germany, France, right? Italy, the US, the UK, South Korea. And that's why I say there's a little bit of good news for South Africa, is we're slightly above our contribution to the world's population. We should be at 0.76, which is our share of the world's population, but we actually have 1.21 as a share of STEM institutions, right? So keep in mind that it's not only a one-way bet, but you can look at other economies, right? And you can see that some are actually at par and some doing much better than others. So now, what about inequality? Really important, right? So remember, I've got rates of change, but I also have inequality of STEM fields and of technology consumption and technology production. The Gini coefficient, remember, tertiary gross enrollment rates. So these are shares of people at the universities. How is that distributed across countries? How unequally distributed it is? Well, it's high, right? But it's actually been declining. So the Gini has actually come down, which means that there is, on average in the global sample, right, a decline in tertiary gross enrollment rates. However, no change in quality differences, 0.60 to 0.61. So many of the global discussions we've had with the World Bank and others say the focus on education, the focus on higher education should be less, just in weighting terms, on quantity and more on quality. The Gini, it looks like South Africa's income inequality Gini, right? It's a massive Gini in terms of inequality of quality of education, right? Because it's QS ranked and STEM fields. So if you're thinking of, yes, you may have a sufficient number of doctors, engineers, and so on. In fact, chances are, on average, if you're a poor country, you have too few of those. But even those few that you have, the quality at which they operate is incredibly poor, and the quality differential, quality inequality, if you like, has not changed. Okay, in fact, it's increased marginally. There's a little bit of good news in the G20, which is a bit of an odd sample. So it's maybe a mixture of developing and developed countries, a slight decline, but not major. So putting it all together, and hopefully you can begin to see how, and I'll just pause a little bit here, because the next, I only have 3 more slides, but the next 2 slides are really important in how we think about the technology gap as an index, as a synthetic index. Is, remember I said, back to the little equation, we have consumption, technology consumption or adoption, technology production, and human capital. So I've given you lots of data about inequality, rates of change, but how do I bring it together, right? And so we have, so there is a methodology, which I don't describe here, which allows you to put different measures, right, of tertiary enrollment rates, of internet usage rates, of patent applications, different measures into one index, right? And that's, we use the underlying, what is called an Alki-Foster multidimensional index, vulnerability index, to actually bring it together. And we ask the question, has technology vulnerability or the technology gap in the world economy changed? And in essence, I want you to just land on this number here, just so you can get your way around, see your way around this notion of the global technology gap index, right? Is it shows that 61% of countries in the global sample, so that's most countries in the world, right, are classified as having a technology gap. So they are below what we define as a technology vulnerability line, if you want it, right? But note that that technology gap has declined. So when I put together adoption, production, education into one index, can I get a single measure? Yes, I can. 61. So that's a large number, right? 61% of countries are still below what would be constituted as an average measure of technology adoption, production, or education, right? Where the smallest gaps? Well, only 54% of countries compared to 61 globally have a gap, right? Or are below this line, if you like, in terms of technology adoption. And that's because of rapid internet usage rates. But when you go to technology production, the gap is larger. There's 68% of countries can be defined as having a technology gap. In education, 61% of countries can be classified as having a technology education gap in terms of quantity and quality. What does this suggest? Well, a couple of things. One is, right, that if you're looking at the digital divide, let's go back to our sort of populist word, right? It's alive and well. The digital divide is alive and well as measured by adoption, production, and education. That's that number. 61% of countries in the world economy experience a digital divide. But secondly, that digital divide is driven disproportionately by production, right? There's massive gap in patent applications and ICT exports. And secondly, it's driven by the gaps in quantity, but I would emphasize quality of STEM fields accumulation. There are other ways in which to think about the absolute technology gap, and I've got something called the average technology gap. I thought about including it or not, but they're there for you to read through, but in essence, it's a relative measure. So the question we're asking is about progress. And so even though you've got 61% of countries that are below the gap, right, below the line, if you like, they still have this technology gap, that's slightly declined for those that have experienced a technology gap. Now, second last slide is, what's the driver? And you can expect the answer, right? What's been driving this global digital divide in the world economy? And our answer over time, 2004 to 2020, is two-part. Firstly, the driver was in the early period, right, this massive differential, right, as a contribution to our overall technology gap index, we calculate shares, right, was higher education. So the quality differential in STEM fields explains, even by the end of the period, about a quarter of the digital divide in the world economy. But the bigger explanation is patent applications. It explains a third of the technology gap in the world economy, right? So if you wanted to lock on to what are the two big drivers of the world's digital divide and growing technology gap, it's patent applications and quality differentials in STEM fields. They alone explain close to 60% of the technology gap in the world economy. So for me, it's really crucial that as my last slide is really about policy and think about policy options, and it goes into the nitty-gritty details, a little bit boring, but it's important in terms of how to move the dial in terms of closing the technology gap. But just to quickly conclude in terms of how we've thought about our results is that we wanted to move away from, let's call it the nebulous notion of the digital divide. I just don't think it's a useful analytical device, and actually think of it as being composed of three indicators: technology adoption, technology production, and human capital. And what we find is that most of the action in terms of exacerbating this technology gap, the global digital divide in the world economy, exists in technology production and human capital accumulation. And unless we fix those two, right, you're going to see this continuous growth in the digital divide, driven mainly by the massive advances in patent applications, and I would argue quality of STEM fields that you see in the advanced world plus China. So what can we do? And I'll stop there. There are little things that are quite important. You've seen this very low absolute level of internet usage rates in low-income countries, right? And lower middle-income countries, including South Africa. And there, for me, there's a great index called the Internet Poverty Index, which has been produced by the World Data Lab. And what they show is that internet poverty levels can be higher in countries that are equally poor. And that's a lot to do with prices of telecommunications. So and in South Africa, we know this, right? That if you look at data packages and pricing of data packages, that actually acts as a key deterrent to greater internet usage rates. Patent applications is difficult, right? But there has to be, right, an innovation policy package that runs from higher education institutions where a lot of the innovation happens, right through to SMEs and large dominant firms. So if you think of venture capital, if you think of where the CEO of Sygnia is heavily involved as well, former CEO of Sygnia, it's the idea that you can move from where innovation and new ideas originate, namely universities, and then push that right through to final market offerings. But we don't have that stitched up carefully enough by incentives that government can offer through a clear technology policy at the country level. Higher education institutions, right? If you look at R&D expenditure by governments, it's always the last thing that governments think about. So the idea that you need to spend huge amounts of money on research and development so that crazy scientists and thinkers can come up with crazy ideas that may lead nowhere, but in fact that one idea will take you to inventing something new and innovative that can lead to patents is very far away from the minds of policymakers. So for me, that remains a key area of thinking through how you can actually overcome the digital divide through this greater investment in higher education institutions. Okay, I think I've kept you here for a full hour, so let me stop and see if we have any questions. So let's just call up my... So there's a question about patent applications. It's not clear to me that it's anything to do about legislative frameworks, right? I mean, there may be a possibility that patent application or let's say originators of new ideas in the South African context can't find funders for their new ideas and take them abroad where and I guess this is my policy point, where there are more fertile venture capital opportunities and so on. So I think that's definitely the case. I'm not sure if there's much more that can be done in terms of the legislation around patent applications. It would be very unusual to force individuals who've moved abroad, for example, to then register their patents in South Africa. I don't think we're doing enough. There's another question in terms of our own talent pool. That is my point, right? To protect South African innovation and patents. I don't think we're doing a good job at all. Yes, so here's a great point about data, right? So university enrollment, of course, is not a good measure because you want to see completion rates. There's no data on completion rates. You don't get data at the country level on university completion rates. Yeah, it's a good question about India. Why is India so much lower than China? Let me just go back to that. I actually didn't. So let's just see. India's at 25. India's about consistent with its global share. So that's the number I really am interested in, right? So actually, in a relative sense, India is at about 1. This is a good point to compare, right? India is at about 1, and China, in fact, relative to its global population, is below par, right? You'd expect, right, China to have many more STEM universities, top 500, than India because of population differences. And so when we take that into account, in fact, China is underrepresented. So too many. Yes, so the idea that you've got too many school leavers, I don't think the problem is that too many school leavers have university entrance requirements. I think we've got too few. And I think that points to the quality differential, right? So even as large as our quality differential is on independent test scoring, it's internally even not good enough to get enough leavers, school leavers into university. And I think that alone is a challenge, which is converting high school graduation into improved university enrollment levels. And then for South Africa, I think the STEM fields enrollment levels are far too low. I think, you know, if we can think of a bias in the higher education sector towards the STEM fields, and an explicit one, universities, I've been saying this for years, should be getting a higher subsidy for a STEM field enrollee or student relative to a non-STEM student, and change that differential or double it over time. I think that would change incentives in the higher education system. So the last question, contributor, was education early on, then patent applications. Do we expect production or exports to become? I think that's a great point. So you may see an evolution over time, but I still think that we in the midst, right? We're living through the midst of a technology revolution. So I think patent applications inequality will remain and possibly even grow, right? But you're right that then is a predictor for growing inequality in production and export. So I think it's a great point that you may actually see growing inequality in high-tech exports. Okay, I'll just give it another minute. I don't think I see any more questions. Yes, so there was a question now from Conrad. Doesn't quality education from ECD? Oh, yes. So the point is, isn't it all linked? And of course it is, right? So as you go from ECD right through to the quality of STEM fields, of course it's linked, right? And I think, and so one of the reasons I put that little quality of schooling graphic there was to show why you are going to see these different rankings in STEM fields. And so the notion that you have one top 500 STEM university in the entire low-income country sample is precisely because from ECD through to schooling, you've got these low quality levels. That's exactly right. And so the answer is not only to focus on STEM fields, but I do think we get a little bit into the global debates around education and human capital. Is too much emphasis has been placed on schooling and enrollment rates, just in terms of policy bias. And as a consequence, countries and multilaterals haven't focused enough on higher education and the quality of higher education. And that's the point I guess I'm getting at. Okay, I think we are out of questions. Thank you very much again, everybody, for attending. It's much appreciated, and I'm sure the Sygnia team will come back with future seminars and future speakers. Thanks very much.